Chapter 1. Let Freedom Ring. A sacred moment in a grove of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. A song, impromptu, from the souls of black folk moved witnesses to tears. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. It began with an elderly man possessed of a strong, if gravelly, voice. Between one moment and the next, two women joined in. Soon, more black voices were aloft, singing of rocks and rills, of woods and templed hills, of freedom ringing out. When white people lent their voices to the song, I motioned them to silence, remembered Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, remarking upon his tearfulness that day. I never saw anything so electric, he added. It made all other words cheap. It seemed the choked voice of a race at last unloosed. This electric, majestic moment happened on Thursday, January 1st, 1863, more than 600 bloody days into the Civil War, America's second revolution. That grove of live oaks was next to Camp Saxton in Port Royal, South Carolina, which had been under Union occupation since late 1861. The gathering in the grove was a celebration of what the formidable Frederick Douglass called the Trump of Jubilee, President Abraham Lincoln's grand Emancipation Proclamation. It declared people enslaved in rebel-held territory free. On the 1st of January, 1863, we held services for the purpose of listening to the reading of President Lincoln's proclamation. It was a glorious day for us all, and we enjoyed every minute of it. Susie King Taylor, Reminiscences of My Life in Camp with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers, 1902. It was shortly after the reading of Lincoln's proclamation that the singing of My Country, 'Tis of Thee swept over the vast crowd of thousands, roughly 700 of whom were members of a proud black regiment under Colonel Higginson's command, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. Dr. Seth Rogers, the regiment's white chief surgeon, also witnessed that moment of soaring song. When he wrote to his wife, Hannah, of the most eventful day of his life, he said that the spontaneous outburst of love and loyalty to a country that has heretofore so terribly wronged these blacks was the birth of a new hope in the honesty of her intention. Just think of it. The first day black people had ever had a country, Colonel Higginson later proclaimed, declaring that the life of the whole day was in those unknown people's song. After Higginson addressed the crowd in that grove of live oaks, he presented the color bearers, Sergeant Prince Rivers and Corporal Robert Sutton, with the flags they were to keep flying high and out of enemy hands in battle. Prince Rivers vowed that he would die before he surrendered his flag. Prince Rivers, a 5'10", dark-skinned man with light eyes, had endured some 40 years in slavery on Henry Middleton Stewart's plantation along the Coosaw River near Beaufort, South Carolina, not far from Port Royal. A house servant and coachman, Rivers learned to read and write while enslaved. He did so at great peril. Rivers risked a brutal whipping, being sold farther south, or other forms of punishment if found out. In early 1862, Rivers pulled off the ultimate act of resistance. He swiped one of his owner's finest horses and escaped from Edgefield, South Carolina, where Stewart had moved because of the war. Skirting Confederate troops, brave Prince Rivers rode more than 100 miles to Union lines near Port Royal. A born leader, Prince Rivers was not only a color-bearer in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, but also the regiment's provost sergeant, its law and order man. Said Colonel Higginson of Rivers, "There is not a white officer in this regiment who has more administrative ability or more absolute authority over the men, and if there should ever be a black monarchy in South Carolina, he will be its king." Contraband, is what the Union called Prince Rivers, and other enslaved people who walked, ran, rode, galloped, and swam to the Union lines. Contraband of war. Confiscated enemy property used to aid the rebellion, from vessels and weapons to people. The designation began with the Union's General Benjamin Franklin Butler, a rotund and rather pompous man who hailed from Massachusetts. Back on the night of Thursday, May 23, 1861, a month after the war broke out, 3 enslaved men, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, escaped from Norfolk, Virginia, where they were forced to do construction work for the Confederacy at Sewell's Point. Worse, they were soon to be carted off to North Carolina, separated from their families. In a skiff and under cover of night, the 3 desperate men rowed across the waters of Hampton Roads to a fortress under Union control, the behemoth Fort Monroe, on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Baker, Mallory, and Townsend pleaded with General Benjamin Butler, the fort's commander, for sanctuary. When the 3 men's owner, Confederate Colonel Charles Mallory, got wind of their whereabouts, he dispatched an emissary, Major John Carey, to get his property back. Since the start of the war, more often than not, when enslaved people sought asylum at a Union fort or camp, they were rebuffed, or worse, returned to their owners as required by the Constitution and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. What would General Butler do? He decided to keep the 3 men. But wasn't Butler obligated to abide by the law? Major Carey pressed. I am under no constitutional obligations to a foreign country, which Virginia now claims to be, replied Butler, a lawyer. He was keeping the men as contraband of war. Virginia had used them against the Union. Butler would use them on the Union's behalf. Coincidentally, Virginia voters ratified their state's ordinance of secession on the very day the 3 black men escaped captivity. General Butler would only reconsider his position if Colonel Mallory pledged allegiance to the United States. That didn't happen. Thus, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend were not hauled back into the hell of slavery. Instead, they became laborers at Fort Monroe. Though I was a mere child during the preparation for the Civil War and during the war itself, I now recall the many late-at-night whispered discussions that I heard my mother and the other slaves on the plantation indulge in. These discussions showed that they understood the situation and that they kept themselves informed of events by what was termed the grapevine telegraph. Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, an Autobiography, 1901. Word of General Benjamin Butler's stance spread fast. For black people in the area, Fort Monroe became freedom's fortress. Within days of Butler's decision, nearly 50 had made a mad dash there. Up to this time, I have had come within my lines men and women with their children, entire families, each family belonging to the same owner, wrote Butler to a superior, General Winfield Scott, on May 27, 1861. Butler told Scott that he had decided to employ the able-bodied, issuing proper food for the support of all, and charging against their services the expense of care and sustenance of the non-laborers. African Americans were not only making tracks for freedom's fortress. Within weeks of Butler's decree, scholar Adam Goodhart tells us, enslaved people were reported flocking to the Union lines just about anywhere there were Union lines. In August 1861, the U.S. Congress passed and President Lincoln signed the first Confiscation Act. It made General Butler's off-the-cuff decree law. By then, more than 900 black men and women, girls and boys, had made their way to freedom's fortress alone. One of those bold souls was Henry Harry Jarvis, an oysterman from Virginia's eastern shore. Harry Jarvis was an imposing, impressive man. Over 6 feet tall and well-built, he was said to have a shapely head, a Roman nose, and the eye of a hawk, and might have been a model for a Greek chisel, the young Hercules in bronze, or a gladiator ready for the imperial review. In the spring of 1861, Jarvis, 25 or thereabouts, made up his mind to escape after his owner, the meanest man on the eastern shore, shot at him. For days, Harry Jarvis lay low in the woods with a friend bringing him food and news. Jarvis waited for just the right moment to take his liberty. It would come on the day of his owner's birthday bash, a time when the man and his friends would be boozing it up and carrying on into the wee hours. That was to be his freedom date. 3 weeks passed by the time Jarvis lit out in stolen goods, a canoe from a white man, a sail from a black man. After a stormy start, he was blessed with a steady breeze at his back. By morning, he was 35 miles away across the James River and at Freedom's Fortress. Like other black men, Jarvis yearned to fight for the Union. When he told General Butler of this desire, the white man snapped that it was not a black man's war. Jarvis shot back that it would be a black man's war before they got through. Though black men, such as my fourth great-grandfather John Redmond, had fought for the nation's independence in the American Revolution, they were excluded from serving in the U.S. Army in 1792. This wasn't the case with the Navy. Instead of remaining at Fort Monroe, Jarvis joined the crew of a commercial vessel that would take him to Cuba, Haiti, and Liberia, West Africa. Of course, back at Freedom's Fortress, Harry Jarvis's retort to General Butler was spot on, for freedom was ringing out. In August 1862, the Second Confiscation Act went into effect, rendering enslaved people who made it to Union lines captives of war, who would be forever free of their servitude and not again held as slaves. There was also a new Militia Act. It gave Lincoln the green light to employ blacks as laborers in the Army for $10 per month and one ration, $3 of which, monthly pay, may be in clothing. What's more, by the summer of 1862, slavery had been abolished in the District of Columbia and the Western Territories. The end of slavery in the capital came at a price that sickened abolitionists, though. The federal government was to pay owners up to $300 per enslaved person. The two Confiscation Acts, along with the new Militia Act, culminated in the Emancipation Proclamation. This 1863 decree, which Lincoln called a fit and necessary war measure for putting down the rebellion, fired up more black people to escape captivity. It also propelled black men in the North and South, freeborn and freed, boatsmen, field hands, artisans, mechanics, merchants, to join the Union's armed forces, for Lincoln's proclamation also said that black men could be soldiers. As fate would have it, the first black Union regiment came from South Carolina, the first of the 11 Southern states to secede, December 20th, 1860, and the state where the war began when, on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons blasted the Union's Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. More than a year later, in late summer 1862, the Union's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, an asthmatic and abrasive Ohioan with a beard, authorized the fiery-eyed yet gentle abolitionist General Rufus Saxton of Massachusetts, the Department of the South's military governor stationed in South Carolina, to raise black troops there. A few months later, Colonel Higginson was on the scene to take command. Thus, the birth of the first South Carolina Volunteers, or rather its rebirth. Back in early May 1862, Union General David Hunter, then the commander of the Department of the South, declared people enslaved in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina to be free. Hunter also began raising a black regiment in South Carolina. Prince Rivers was in that regiment. General Hunter had even taken Rivers on a recruiting mission to New York City, where some white people, livid over the sight of a black man in uniform, bombarded Rivers with stones and racial slurs. 10 days after General Hunter issued his proclamation of liberation, Abraham Lincoln voided it. At the time, the president was doing his utmost to keep the border states from bolting. These were the slave states that had not joined the Confederacy: Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. After Hunter's unauthorized actions, Lincoln tried to make a deal with representatives of the border states and Virginia's western counties, which had seceded from the Old Dominion. He pleaded with them to agree to compensated gradual emancipation, payment for ending slavery at some point in the future. No, they said. All along, Lincoln publicly proclaimed that the war was about the restoration of the Union, not ending slavery. Then, the winds of war, from the Union's failed Peninsula Campaign to take Richmond, Virginia, the second capital of the Confederacy, in the spring and summer of 1862, to the Union's need for more boots on the ground, caused Lincoln to change course. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after the Union's victory in the Battle of Antietam, the war's bloodiest single day of combat, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In it, he gave the Confederacy 100 days to cease hostilities. If it didn't, come January 1, 1863, he would release a final Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln kept his word, as the folks down in Port Royal learned when the new year rolled around. Decked out in blue jackets, scarlet pants, and broad-brimmed hats, Sergeant Prince Rivers and his comrades shouted, "Hurrah!" throughout Camp Saxton on New Year's Day, 1863. It was a day of surging jubilation, of freedom ringing out, of joy overflowing among liberty-loving people around the nation. In Port Royal, the day was capped with a grand barbecue. The road to war. The Civil War was a long time coming. Its causes include the following. Compromise of 1850, September 1850. This series of statutes was intended to diffuse North-South tensions over the more than 500,000 square miles of land the United States gained for $15 million at the end of the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. This land included all or parts of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. In this compromise, among other things, California entered the Union as a free state. Slave trading in the District of Columbia, but not slavery itself, was abolished. And there was a new Fugitive Slave Act that favored slaveholders. For one, federal marshals in the North were compelled to assist slave hunters. Anyone abetting a fugitive could be fined $1,000 and imprisoned for 6 months. Kansas-Nebraska Act, May 30, 1854. This superseded part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had admitted Maine into the Union as a free state and Missouri as a slave state, while banning slavery in the rest of the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, above the parallel 36 degrees 30 minutes. This land included the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, where slavery would now be a matter of popular sovereignty, that is, left up to their white male settlers. This led to a violent clash between pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists, known as Bleeding Kansas. The issue remained unresolved until Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state in January 1861. Dred Scott decision, March 6, 1857. Because their owner had them living on free soil for a while, in Wisconsin Territory for one, Dred Scott and his wife, Harriet, enslaved in St. Louis, Missouri, sued for their freedom and that of their 2 daughters. Dred Scott's case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where, in his opinion for the court, Chief Justice Roger Taney concluded Scott had no right to bring his suit because, whether enslaved or free, blacks were not citizens of the United States. John Brown's Raid, October 16, 1859. White firebrand John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now in West Virginia, with a small band of black and white men that included his sons. Brown's goal was to ignite an uprising among enslaved people in the area. The raid failed, and John Brown was hanged. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was one of the raid's financial backers. Lincoln's election to the presidency, November 6, 1860. In the run-up to the election of 1860, many white Southerners, most of them Democrats, vowed disunion if the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, won the presidency. While not an abolitionist, an advocate for the immediate end of slavery throughout the nation, Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. He wasn't alone. Free soil was one of the principles of the nascent Republican Party. founded in 1854. Some white Americans were free soilers because they despised slavery. Others because they loathed the idea of wealthy Southern planters gobbling up the land. They wanted the territories populated by white farmers who cultivated their own small farms. South Carolina's secession, December 20th, 1860. At a convention in Charleston, the Palmetto State left the Union. It then urged others to join it in forming a confederacy of slaveholding states. By the time Lincoln reached Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, March 4, 1861, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas had heeded South Carolina's call. A month earlier, in February 1861, a new republic had been born, the Confederate States of America. Attack on Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861. Confederate cannons bombarded Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, until the fort's commander surrendered late the following day. President Lincoln promptly called for 75,000 troops to crush the rebellion. Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia joined the Confederacy that spring.